I'd like to introduce our next panel chair, Dr. Vanessa Barlowski. Barolsky, beg your pardon, Vanessa. Vanessa is a researcher in both our challenging racism and enhancing social belonging, and also the building resilience to social harm research teams within CRIS. Vanessa works across several disciplinary areas, including sociology, anthropology, and criminology, to tackle questions related to social conflict and its transformation. Much of Vanessa's work has been conducted in the South African context, but has global applicability. This includes critical engagements with social cohesion, truth and reconciliation, as well as political and criminal violence and terrorism. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Shahram, and welcome to everyone to the second keynote of the CRIS conference. This keynote is entitled Everyday Resilience, Fact or Fiction for Young People in Significantly Stressed African Ecologies. So it's my honor to introduce Professor Theron, who is a full professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Professor Theron currently leads multi-year resilience studies for sites in South Africa, India, Canada, and Russia, and has authored more than 100 peer-reviewed publications about child and youth resilience. Her clinical and research interest is in child and adolescent resilience, with a particular focus on how situational and cultural context impact on the multi-systemic resources that matter most for the resilience of young people from chronically disadvantaged communities like South Africa. So South Africa is my home country, as was mentioned a bit earlier, so I'm very familiar with many of the challenges of persistent adversity and extraordinary resilience among young people in the South African context. So I'm very excited to hear Professor Theron's input and her presentation. As with the other sessions, please post any questions that you have during the presentation in the Q&A, and we'll have about 10 minutes to take those questions at the end. Thank you. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barolsky, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to share my screen and then I'll greet everybody. Let me make sure. There we go. Is that clear? Vanessa, can you perhaps just let me know? Great, that you can see it. So hello to everybody. I wanted to say good morning because it's early morning here in South Africa, but I know that it's certainly not early morning for you in Australia, so I'll say hello. And thank you so much to the conference organizers for this wonderful invitation and the privilege of being able to talk with you today and to explore with you whether there really is such a thing as everyday resilience for young people in significantly stressed African ecologies. Now, as I believe you all know, even though resilience has been formally researched for, what, is it over half a century now, how best to define resilience still elicits really robust debate. And so given that, I thought that it might be best at the outset of my talk this morning to clarify what I mean when I refer to resilience. So in short, when I talk about resilience today, I understand resilience to be the capacity of a dynamic system, like a young person living in Africa, or their family, or their community, to adapt well to stresses that are so significant that they can derail how that young person or their family or their community is functioning, surviving, or developing. But what I want to emphasize, what I really want to be absolutely clear about, is that that adaptive capacity requires the engagement of multiple resources that are distributed across multiple systems. So in the case of a young person living in Africa, some of those resources will be found in the systems in the young person themselves, but others will or should perhaps be found in systems within that young person's social, institutional, and ecological environment. So if I put that differently, What I'm saying is that resilience is much more than a psychological trait or some sort of personal quality, as was suggested by early resilience research. Instead, this capacity to adjust successfully to shocks and to stresses requires a complex biopsychosocial ecological composite of interacting and intersecting resources. And I'll talk more about that as my talk unfolds. Using this multi-systemic understanding of resilience, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore with you whether resilience is indeed ordinary and everyday for young people living in Africa. And I'm going to do that by briefly introducing you, really briefly, to some of the challenges that pervade Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Next, I'll highlight what appears to commonly inform African young people's capacity to adapt successfully to the many challenges that really are everyday, and probe whether those resources are really so ordinary after all. And then I'll conclude by considering what we as a community of resilience researchers and a community of resilience champions can learn from the resilience of young people living in stressed ecologies in Africa. Now, just a word of warning, you'll see as I proceed with my talk that my slides are peppered with photographs of African animals. And that's partly because I've just returned from a really gorgeous 2-week safari in the Ecologies Trans-Frontier Park that straddles Botswana and Africa. And I can see Vanessa smiling, so I assume she knows how beautiful it is. And so I'm very enamored with African wildlife. It's truly magnificent. And I hope that my slides will enamor you too. But as you will also see, the same photographs actually function as metaphors for the ordinariness and the extraordinariness of African youth resilience. And we'll talk more about that as my talk proceeds. So let's set the scene. African people are overly familiar with stresses and shocks. And that relates to a number of issues, but possibly the most pervasive one is the fact that Africa is the world's poorest continent. Around 85% of the people living in Africa subsist on less than $5.50 per day. To illustrate it further for you, let me say that of the 27 poorest countries in the world, 23 are in Africa. Africa is also home to 6 of the world's most unequal countries, unfortunately including my own. And those unequal countries are countries where a minority of people are well off, while the majority really struggle or are destitute. Now, although some progress has been made, projections by the World Bank continue to show that extreme poverty is actually showing few signs of improvement in sub-Saharan Africa. And so it's really unlikely that poverty or extreme poverty will be eradicated by 2030. And what I need you to understand today is that being poor is not just defined by a lack of income. Instead, being poor is this really multi-dimensional set of hardships. Amongst the many hardships that are associated with being poor, there is the fact that being poor translates into an inequitable access to opportunity. And in Africa, that typically includes inequitable access to quality education and inequitable access to decent work. It also translates into inequitable access to all the basic resources that are so fundamental to human beings' capacity to survive, particularly in Africa, access to nutritious food. And then it also translates into inequitable access to basic services, including healthcare, reliable energy, running water in homes, and decent sanitation. Now, of course, it stands to reason that those who are poor are even more vulnerable to the shocks that pervade Africa. And those shocks include armed conflict, they include terrorism, they include insurrection. They also include extreme weather events. These are increasing at a really frightening rate in Africa. And then, obviously, not just in Africa, but particularly also for the poor in Africa, it means that people are even more vulnerable to health pandemics and health-related shocks. And so I think the important point to make about these is that the impacts of these shocks disrupt family and community livelihoods. And so they aggravate the chronic stresses that I referred to previously, like the inequitable access to opportunity and inequitable access to basic material resources. So in short, although his statement was incredibly offensive, but it is Donald Trump that we're talking about, Donald Trump's reference to Africa being a shithole actually speaks, I think, to this dreadful multidimensionality of poverty and the relentless related exposure to what is apparently intractable hardship. Now, the young people that I have the privilege of working with in Africa can actually teach Donald Trump a thing or two about how to put the experience of this hardship into much more eloquent wording. And when I talk to young people in Africa about their experience of these daily challenges, they talk about the multidimensionality of poverty as something that undermines their basic human right to a life of dignity. And they use words like the experience just leaves them helpless and hopeless. And the first time I heard those words, they were uttered by a young man by the name of David, who was a postgraduate student at the time. He's now a very successful clinical psychologist. But he was telling me about the community that he came from and how it really made him feel desperate, that what he would see when he left his house was just people sitting on the sidewalks, sitting on the pavements with nothing to do and no hope for the future. And his words were, Linda, I'm just helpless, I'm hopeless, we are all helpless and we are all hopeless. And often when I talk with young people that I work with in Africa, I ask them to draw their experience because it's a way of them being able to portray what they have first-hand knowledge of without having to use words. And they draw drawings like the one that you are seeing on my slide that just portray the absolute despair and the distress of facing relentless difficulty because of where they live. And so I think the bottom line is that life in Africa is really hard for many, many young people. So that brings us then to the resilience of African young people to these apparently relentless shocks and stresses. And so maybe to say that there are relatively few epidemiological studies of mental health or well-being or quality of life or similar positive outcomes among youth in Africa. But even so, the studies that have been done report levels of mental health, of hopefulness, of well-being and positive youth development that are more or less comparable to the levels that are reported for young people living elsewhere, living in continents that are not African. And so as in these studies elsewhere, it would seem that most African young people do not report unsuccessful outcomes, despite these incredibly difficult life circumstances that they face. And African young people themselves, when you interact with them, when you talk to them about their experience of these hardships and how they cope with them, are relatively quick to acknowledge, albeit very humbly, to acknowledge their resilience and to talk about how their continued hopefulness, their continued investment in education, their ability and dreams of contributing to their family and their communities are indicators of their capacity to show resilience. Many of these young people, when you talk with them about why this is, explain that the context of chronic stresses and chronic shocks actually makes resilience a must. It's kind of a default. There is, for many of them, they say, no other option. And so a possible paradoxical takeaway for those of us who are studying resilience and thinking about how to make resilience ordinary is that if we want resilience to be quotidian, then perhaps we need to make sure that exposure to challenges need to be fairly routine too. In some ways, I think that fits with what Michael Rutter spoke about in the earlier studies of resilience and has written about, that limited or manageable risk exposure has a stealing or a fortifying effect, particularly for subsequent risk exposure. And perhaps we need to think some more about that. But in addition to how challenges prompt resilience, reviews of resilience studies with young people living in Africa show that their capacity to adapt successfully to the hardship that characterizes life in Africa is actually informed by more than this everyday reality of risk. Instead, their capacity to remain invested in education, to remain hopeful about the future, to be civically engaged, to report minimal levels of psychological distress, is informed by resilience enablers that are actually quite commonplace. And so by commonplace, what I mean is that the resources that they report fit really well with those that have been reported again and again and again in studies of youth resilience in other majority world contexts, such as South America, for example, and minority or more developed world contexts like Europe, North America, and your own in Australia. And no surprise, one of the most prominent of these commonly reported resources in accounts of African young people's resilience is the self. It's young people's personal strengths, including the personal strengths that they use to adapt well to structural disadvantage, to extreme weather events, and to armed conflict. And rather than talk to you about these many, many studies that have been reviewed, I'm going to illustrate these personal strengths by introducing you to Simpiwe. And Simpiwe is a young man. You can see his photograph on my slide. And he, like the other young people in the studies that I've worked with, have given express permission for me to use their photograph and their names and to introduce you to them. I wish he could be speaking to you in my place. But Simpiwe is a young man that was a youth advisor in the Resilient Youth in Stressed Environments, or RISE study, that Dr. Michael Unger and I currently co-lead. And the RISE study includes really stressed environments in both Canada and in South Africa. And Simpiwe lives in one of the stressed communities in South Africa. And his community is stressed not only by toxic levels of pollution because it's adjacent to a large petrochemical plant, but it's also stressed by structural disadvantage, by high incidence of communicable disease, by violent crime, by rampant unemployment, and many other hardships. And so in short, in Simpiwe's words, living in this community means that suffering is every day. It's an everyday reality that cannot be escaped. Nevertheless, when Simpiwe talks about his experience of life in this community and his resilience, he's emphatic that this everyday reality of suffering has never eclipsed, he's never allowed it to eclipse his vision for a future that is completely different from his present. And that includes a future that will be materially secure and that will allow him and his family to know dignity. Now, when Simpiwe talks about this, what's really important is that he refers to habits, and he refers to habits that he believes he cultivated, and that these habits are essential to the realization of his dream. These habits are the mechanism by which he believes he can make the dream come true. And so amongst others, what Simpiwe talks about when he talks about these habits that he's cultivated is that he prioritizes his physical and his psychological health. And he takes action to make sure that he remains physically healthy and psychologically strong. He talks often about how he searches for knowledge, mainly via reading books that he loans from the local library or that he loans from friends, but he searches for knowledge about entrepreneurial skills that will allow him to have a materially secure future. Because given that the rampant unemployment, searching for a job is probably not the best way to make his vision for the future come true. And then Simpiwe is incredibly fussy, and he acknowledges this with this beautifully broad smile. He's incredibly fussy about whom he befriends, and incredibly fussy about what thoughts he repeatedly thinks. He doesn't allow negative friends and negative thoughts to muddy his mind, is what he says. So essentially, when Simpiwe accounts for his resilience, he's pointing to the resilience enabling value of personal agency, right? He's talking about hopeful meaning making. He's talking about the capacity for self-regulation and problem solving. And all of these are well reported, and Maston has included them in her shortlist of commonly occurring adaptive capacities. And so even though her shortlist is largely based on Western studies of resilience, there are these lovely overlaps between Simpiwe's account of his resilience and the studies that have been reviewed of African young people's resilience and what we know about the personal resources that matter. But before you begin to think that it's personal resources that are truly the reason for African young people to be resilient, let me caution you that personal capacity is only part of what makes resilience ordinary in Africa. In addition to these personal resources, supportive others are hugely prominent when young people account for their resilience. And typically, these others hold young people accountable and teach them self-regulation. They make sure that young people have a vision for the future. These others also model adaptive agency. They encourage hopeful meaning making. They scaffold problem solving. They ensure a sense of security. And very importantly, in the context of poverty in Africa, they share material resources or find ways to support young people to access really necessary material resources. Now, what I think is important for our understanding of ordinary resilience is that although these supportive others are reported in literature that pertains to the resilience of young people from all over the world, they are actually, when you look at the way young people describe them, they're actually incredibly contextually relevant, with context being understood as situational, as cultural, and as fluid. So if I put that differently, what I'm saying is that even though supportive others are a commonly reported resource, their form is distinctive in that it fits a given situation and a given cultural context, which is essentially African, given that I work with African young people. And so to illustrate what I mean by that, I'm going to play you a really short video clip. And it's a video clip of a washing powder advertisement. The washing powder is called Omo, and it aired in South Africa some years ago. And so here it comes.
This Father's Day, thank you for always being there for me. You took me to my first soccer match and clapped for me when I kicked the goal. You taught me how to build a fire, to tie a tie, and hammer a hammer. And it is important to work hard in school and to also have fun. You always said a good man is strong and kind. Gogo, you are my hero.
And so isn't that just beautiful? This little boy who is making a Father's Day card for his gogo, and gogo is the African word for granny. And so like many other young people who talk about their resilience in Africa, this little boy is absolutely indebted to the woman who took on the role of mother, and more than mother. She was also the father to him, and she taught him all the things that little boys typically need to know in sub-Saharan Africa. And so given the dominance of woman-headed households in South Africa, and indeed across sub-Saharan Africa, it's not surprising that women caregivers are prominent in many accounts of African young people's resilience. It's situationally relevant because women are most likely to be the heads of households. Another example of what I mean by these supportive others being situationally relevant is the prominence of family-like peer communities in many of the resilience counts of young people, particularly those who are street connected or orphaned, or those whose caregivers are HIV positive or HIV affected. And if you think, for example, of the wonderful work that Morten Skovdahl and colleagues have done in Kenya, where he has focused on what enables the resilience of young people who come from HIV-impacted families. There's this rich understanding that young people's resilience is scaffolded by other young people who are also experiencing the difficulties of an HIV-impacted family. And what it translates into is young people becoming one another's champions. They share domestic chores, they share homework, they share school books, they also share fun, they find ways to relax together. And so in a situation where adult family members are no longer readily available, then the support of others would typically be a resilience-enabling peer. Resilience interact with whichever people are available in that given situation and supportive. In addition to the support of others fitting a given situation, I think what is really important to understand is that in Africa, the others that matter for resilience are typically people who reflect, who enact, who embrace the African valuing of an interdependent, flexible collective that goes way beyond the understanding of a nuclear family, as one so often finds when you read the Western resilience literature. And so I'm going to return again to the young people who were our RISE youth advisors, just to illustrate what I mean by this flexible collective. And I'll start again with Simpiwe. And Simpiwe, when he accounted for his resilience, spoke often of the role of his grandparents. He lived with his grandparents from when he was in primary school. So did Mamelo. She spoke a lot about her grandfather. Tulani lives with his grandmother and spoke lots about her, as did Mosna. And what you need to know about these young people is that they are living in households that are intergenerational. So typically there's either a grandmother or a grandfather, sometimes both, as in Simpiwe's case, and then possibly one of their parents, usually not both. Mto spoke at length when he spoke about his resilience about his aunt. He takes his aunt to be his mother. She's his mother figure. But he also spoke about the pastor from his local church, and he spoke about teachers. And both the pastor and the teachers took on parent roles, and he believed played a really significant role in his resilience. Thandi acknowledged the resilience-enabling role of her older brothers. She also spoke lots about her mom, who's deceased. And even though her mom is deceased, her mom still has a really strong role in her life, both in terms of what she remembers, but also ancestrally. And then she spoke lots about her friends' parents and the experience that her friends' parents were like parents to her. And then finally, Minky's resilience is inspired by her mom, by her older sister, and by members of her church community who model resilience and whose example she seeks to follow. So what I'm hoping you're hearing is that these young people, when they talk about their resilience, they make it clear that their capacity to adjust to the hardship of Africa is co-enabled by a mix of family, including immediate and extended family, and then others to whom they are not related, others in their school community, their church community, or their neighborhood. And these others take on a family-like role for them. And so what is really crucial about their resilience is that their accounts, like many others reported in African studies of resilience, speak to the cultural salience of what we call a family community in Africa, and the centrality of family communities to African young people's resilience. Family communities co-facilitate all the adaptive capacities that are so integral to young people's ability to adjust well to these risk-filled lives. And so you are seeing a drawing that was made by one of the participants in an earlier resilience study that I was part of. And her drawing was made in response to me asking her, what was it that had supported her to become as successful as she had, despite the many, many challenges that she faced? And she drew her extended family. And she included in this drawing of the extended family people who've already passed on, and then people who are also living. And both her ancestral relatives and her living relatives made the difference for her in the ways that they co-facilitated her adaptive capacities. And so whilst a family community is typically peopled by immediate and extended kin, including the living, the dead, and the yet unborn, it can also include fictive or social kin, people who take on family-like roles. And so fictive kin have no blood or marriage ties to a child, but they embrace the African maxim of interdependence, and they contribute to the rearing of all young people. They accept the responsibility for the safety and well-being of all young people in their community. And so I really appreciated this photograph that went viral during the really awful June-July 2021 riots that decimated many of our communities here in South Africa. And I think that this photograph captures the importance of fictive kin so well. It shows a mother, you can see her on the roof, she's wearing black. It shows a mother trusting a group of complete strangers to save her baby when she and her baby were trapped in a building that was set alight by a mob of rioters. She trusts them to be fictive kin, to catch her child and to keep her child safe. Kind of tongue-in-cheek on a side note, Michael Unger, and he may have done this in his opening keynote yesterday, I'm not sure, but he often talks about how the resilience driver in the Walt Disney stories that we are also familiar with is a fairy godmother or some magical creature. And I've often said to Mike, gee, Mike, kids in Africa don't need fairy godmothers, and they don't need some sort of mythical, magical force. They have family communities. And so the Lion King movie, which you are probably familiar with, and if you're not, I really encourage you to watch, really portrays the value of a family community, particularly the fictive kin in a family community, when the people, your blood relatives, are no longer available to enable your resilience. And so Simba's triumph is really a co-triumph. It's co-facilitated by his friends, Pumbaa and Timon, and Zazu, and Nola, and Rafiki. And so even Walt Disney gets that family communities are really important to the resilience of African young people. Now, the idea that ordinary resources like supportive others that fit a given situational and cultural context underpin African young people's capacity for everyday resilience is really comforting. That's a comforting idea, right? But I think it's important for us to remember that situational and cultural contexts are fluid. And so we dare not become complacent about this putative ordinariness of resilience. Many African scholars, including Mampela Rampele, have expressed concern about declining allegiance to traditional African culture and young people's tendency to apparently begin to prefer Western ways, individual ways of being, over the time-honored African ways of this trusted collective and interdependent way of being and doing. And so we explored this in the RISE study. We used a latent profile analysis to do that. And we found two dominant profiles, both in South Africa and in Canada. You're seeing both graphs on my slide. But what was comforting was that in South Africa, more young people fit the profile of those who appreciate their cultural heritage and embrace it. And very importantly, for those of us who are interested in resilience, young people who showed robust cultural allegiance were significantly more likely to report far fewer symptoms of depression. And they were also significantly less inclined to engage in conduct disordered acts or to be civically disruptive. And so essentially what this means is that when they participated in family and community traditions and opportunities to engage in spiritual rituals and organized religion, they actually had opportunity to interact with supportive others in their family communities. And there are similar findings when you read the studies about the reintegration of Ugandan child soldiers into the communities, the value of cultural rights in establishing community cohesion and reintegration. And so I guess what I'm saying is that this implies that if we want to make resilience quotidian, we probably need to support young people to appreciate resilience enabling cultural heritage. I'm just going to stop there for a minute because I've just seen that my laptop is not plugged in and I'm going to duck and switch it on. There we go. I would hate it. Apologies for that. I would have hated it to suddenly just blank out. But I emphasize the importance of resilience enabling cultural heritage because there are a handful of really powerful African studies, resilience studies, that suggest that resilience benefits accrue when Africans are courageous enough to disrupt cultural norms that have the potential to obstruct young people's capacity to make hopeful meaning or to seek support from their family community. And so the one that I think of always when I think of these studies is a study by Marguerite Daniels and colleagues. And they found, for example, that when HIV positive caregivers were willing to flout the cultural convention of silence around sex, around life-threatening illness, around death, their children were much better adapted to the challenges of eventually losing their parent and the stigma of HIV. They were much better able to draw on the support of a family community because the cultural convention of silence had been courageously breached. A final important point about the supportive, relevant others that I want to make just briefly, and that I think is really integral to the so-called ordinariness of African young people's resilience, is that these others also show resilience. And so to illustrate this for you, it's not just any women who are prominent in the accounts of African young people's resilience. There's specific mention of them being strong Black women, strong women who are not cowed by routine hardship. I've heard so many inspiring stories from young people about their gogos, their grandmothers and their mothers and their older sisters. And they say things like, you know, Linda, when my gogo told me about what she faced as a child and as a young woman, I thought, my goodness, is what I'm dealing with really so hard? If she could be strong, I can be strong. Similarly, when young people talk about their caregivers, they talk about the fact that the caregivers are warm, that they experience that loving warmth from them. And in fact, in our RISE study, we did an analysis to better understand the importance of this parental warmth. And we found that both younger and older adolescents who reported high levels of school engagement over time. And school engagement over time is really difficult when you live in the challenging context that young people in Africa live in. Young people who reported this high school engagement over time also reported exceptionally high levels of caregiver warmth. And the capacity of a parent or a caregiver to go on being warm flies in the face of theories like the trickle-down theory by Conja and colleagues that posits that exposure to structural disadvantage and related hardship has potential to actually undermine parents' capacity to be warm and to be loving. And yet these parents who are facing the same difficulties as the children they are parenting are able to continue being warm. And so it implies there's the sense that these warm caregivers are showing resilience just like the young people are. What I want to flag is that resilience researchers like Hobful and colleagues have cautioned that over time, resilience resources can become overburdened, they decline. Similarly, Sunia Luthar and many of her colleagues have repeatedly advised that children's capacity for adaptation is intertwined with the resilience of their caregivers, and emphasize that the importance, or rather emphasize that it's really important that if we want to sustain children's resilience, if we want to make young people's resilience ordinary, then we need to sustain the resilience of the caregivers and the systems that support them. So let's talk a little bit about the extraordinariness or the possible extraordinariness of African young people's resilience. While African young people and their resilience is invested in ordinary, everyday, personal and relational resources that are responsive to situational and cultural contexts, I really question that so-called ordinariness. Given the fact that they occur against a backdrop of really scarce institutional, structural, and ecological supports. If you had perhaps been listening to what I have not been reporting in the preceding part of my talk, then you probably by now would be aware that African young people's resilience is typically not attributed to resources beyond themselves or beyond their informal social networks. Now, while it's possible that this is an artifact of personal and relational resources perhaps being more obvious to young people who participate or who participated in our resilience studies, it's equally possible that they don't report these resources because they are not available, or they're available but they're not accessible, or they're available and accessible but not meaningful. And in fact, one of the points that we made in a recently published article on the multi-systemic resources that matter for the resilience of young people in the RISE study is that unlike the young people in the Canadian stressed environments, South African young people's resilience was heavily invested in their personal psychological strength and their informal social networks, and then the nexus of these. That's worrying. For resilience to be truly ordinary, that investment needs to become inclusive of resources across multiple systems, other than informal social systems and psychological systems. If I put that differently, what I'm saying is that given that African young people and their family communities are similarly challenged by Africa's relentless shocks and stresses, I think it's extraordinary that their capacity for resilience persists, even though there are few institutional, structural, and other formal supports that they can draw on. Now, in many parts of Africa, this dearth of institutional, structural, and ecological resources is associated with remarkable African youth agency, this remarkable capacity for African young people to shake things up. And what this youth agency does is it resists the status quo, and it has prompted various forms of social transformation. And Aya Chebi, you're seeing her on my slide. If you have never listened to her, I sincerely encourage you to Google Aya Chebi and to go and listen to her incredibly inspirational speeches. She's the first appointed African Union envoy on youth. Aya believes that Tunisian youth popularized radical political youth action, and that this is a mechanism that African young people use to resist the status quo and to bring about change that would allow Africans, particularly young Africans, to have jobs, to have freedom, and to have dignity. Now, I know there are young people in my country who would disagree with Aya. They would say that this incredible embracing of activism in South Africa is inspired by the multiple examples and role models from the apartheid era in my country. But nevertheless, Aya is quite convinced, and you'll hear this if you were to listen to her, that this capacity to shake things up, this drive to shake things up, was modeled by Tunisian young people. Wherever it started, the fact of the matter is that youth activism is very prominent and very pervasive in Africa. Since the Tunisian uprisings in 2008, I think it was, young people in other African countries have acted, both online, both digitally, but also in person on the streets, to bring about changes that ultimately would lessen the need for resilience to corrupt or incompetent regimes, and also resilience to structural and other violence that is really pervasive in Africa, or at least advanced coping with these struggles. In my own country, for example, young people have campaigned repeatedly for free higher education, and they have been successful, at least, in securing more state funding for disadvantaged students. Now, while this youth agency has been transformational in many ways, what I want us to think about is that it's actually not without cost. Some of the negative consequences, for example, of the At Fees Must Fall campaign in South Africa has included very disrupted academic trajectories. In fact, there were young people who just didn't complete their studies. It includes widespread psychological distress and even trauma, not just to the students who are campaigning, but also to students who were onlookers, who for various reasons couldn't join in the campaign, and to staff. There have been a number of academic staff in South Africa who've been severely traumatized by the experiences of the At Fees Must Fall riots. And then there's been lots of loss of infrastructure. And so in that way, although these young people's agency is incredibly remarkable, their agency should probably be considered ambiguous. Claudia Seymour, who studied the resilience of young people in the conflict-riddled Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, was the first person, I believe, to coin the term ambiguous agency. And it speaks to an agency that is necessary because the resources that ordinarily support young people's capacity to adapt are depleted. But it also flags that such agency typically has short and or long-term negative consequences for young people, including that they are typically branded dangerous troublemakers, and many are incarcerated. I think what also worries me about this ambiguous youth agency, about the fact that African youth agency is necessary to disrupt the status quo, is that there's an implication in a way that young people themselves, rather than civil society, rather than government, are responsible for their resilience, their personal resilience and that of their family communities. I think if we want resilience to be commonplace, then we dare not hold young people responsible for driving change. That doesn't mean we don't embrace the fact that they can drive change. It means that we need to agitate for civil society and for government to work proactively to change multiple systems in order to provide access to contextually meaningful resources beyond those that are found within young people and their family communities. And then likewise, when ordinary resilience enablers are limited, young people often have little other recourse than to engage in unconventional agency. Michael Unger has called this atypical resilience in earlier publications. And in the interest of time, I'll give you one example of what I mean by unconventional agency, and I'll use what is a typically an African example. I don't think it's confined to Africa, but it's quite prominent on the African continent. And that's the example of African young people, typically African young women. There are some African young men too, but it's mostly young women who accept a blesser into their lives. And a blesser is an older person who supposedly blesses them with material or psychological supports, but they come at a cost. They come in exchange, usually, for sexual favors. And although this allows African young people to survive material deprivation or to fund tertiary studies, what is the cost? And so again, we are reminded that when we don't change the systems around young people, they are forced to resort to agencies that have consequences. I think I've got about 5 minutes left, Vanessa, and so I'll take this last part at quite a gallop. But what I'm wanting us to consider now is what can we learn about ordinary resilience from African studies of youth resilience? And I want to say that for starters, ordinary resilience requires purposeful action. We dare not become complacent because so many young people manage to adapt successfully to these relentless stresses and these relentless shocks because of their personal strengths and because of contextually responsive relational capital. As presaged by Brody and colleagues' concerns, that societal complacency breeds a resilience that is only skin deep or temporary. If we fail to nurture the personal and relational resources that matter for the resilience of young people, to nurture them, to sustain them, then probably we are sentencing them to extinction. And so we have to act. So what we need to do is we need to sustain the valued personal supports, but we really need to work incredibly hard to keep this trusted collective intact, so that young people can continue to have a trusted environment of human others that co-champion their resilience. But in addition to that, we really have to champion access to a composite of relevant multi-systemic supports that transcend those resources that are found within young people themselves and within their informal networks. And the importance of the relevance of those supports was demonstrated in a recent study by Lucy Kluver and colleagues. there's a plethora of literature, there's a wealth of literature talking about which supports we might want to put in place to make resilience ordinary. But this study shows that we may not assume which ones are most relevant to which young people in what context. And so Lucy Kluwer and colleagues worked with, I think it was just over 1,000 young people in a really resource-constrained community in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. And they explored the effects of these 6 resources that you can see on my screen to understand which of these resources would best support positive outcomes for this population. And lo and behold, they found that only 3 of the 6 mattered. The 3 that mattered were supporting parents to be better parents, supporting schools to be safe environments, and providing families with government-sponsored cash transfers. And so they found that these 3 supported positive outcomes for this specific population, but they also found that a combination of those resources showed positive cumulative effects. And so this strengthens the idea that making resilience commonplace requires a combination of multiple resources that are distributed across multiple systems. In Africa, as in other majority world contexts, I doubt that we'll manage to make resilience ordinary if social and climate justice are not prioritized. If you've seen the recent UNICEF report was recently released, you'll see that of the 33 countries at extreme risk for climate change and severe weather events, all but 7 are in Africa. And so we need action that is going to drive both social justice and climate justice. And I don't have time to talk to you in detail about the Cape Town Resilience Strategy, unfortunately. I really encourage you to Google it and to read the strategy. It's available online, and to understand that for the city of Cape Town to manage the 2016-2017 drought, they worked in partnership with civil society and government to bring about changes and to facilitate access to resources at multiple system levels. That meant that individual people and their families were no longer solely responsible for their resilience to these climate issues. Then just lastly, if we want resilience to be ordinary, we need to embrace youth agency, and we need to value what they can teach us about non-negotiable change. And if we do that, then hopefully we will take away the need for young people to engage in ambiguous and unconventional agencies, because I think that's going to threaten ordinary resilience. And we need to work with young people to engineer facilitative environments that will make resilience ordinary. Particularly in Africa, where we have this growing youth population, if we want to reap the dividends of the so-called youth bulge, we have to work with young people, and we have to reimagine them not as troublemakers, but as these incredible agents of resilience that we need to be in partnership with. And so if I return to my original question, I think what I have said to you today is that I do believe that lots of the resilience that we see in Africa is ordinary. It's rooted in ordinary resources, but there's a danger that if we don't take those ordinary resources, if we don't expand them, that everyday resilience will become a fiction. And so I'm going to show you one last quick video clip to close with. And what that video clip demonstrates, I believe, is that if we commit to making sure that the resilience resources can go beyond what's in young people and in their immediate informal social networks, then we don't need extraordinary effort. We just need volition, and we need sensitivity to contextual and to contextual dynamics. And this is beautifully illustrated, I think, in this video, and then hopefully there'll be some time for questions.
Why acquire it in Glovo? We are trying to assist children who do not have a voice, a face, or any representation. And we thought that by setting up a choir, they will represent themselves by the beautiful voices and the talents they can show.
It's wonderful to see how they grow and develop and learn to express themselves through beautiful music, and seeing the power of music manifest in who they ultimately become.
before I got involved with the choir, I had no direction. I didn't know who I was and what I was doing. You know, it was very rough. I had no goals. Ukuba nama-bad friends, ukuba nabantu abathanda izinto ezihlangahlangene nje, abantu abanestamp abangazazi bayaphi.
For me, it's a place where I come to escape all my problems. I don't know, I just get this little fuzzy feeling. It's joyful.
The fact that you were born in that double poverty doesn't mean you are poverty. You can grow out of that poverty if excellence is offered to you.
Music is the epitome of human emotion, and programs like the Ndlovu Youth Choir provide an opportunity for young people to express themselves and have a voice they perhaps never knew they had.
It changed me. It made me a better person. And through music, I learned a lot. Through music, there's people now looking up to me.
I am doing something big, something that is going to take me to another level, something that will take me to far places.
I feel relieved. When I'm on stage, I'm on a different platform, and I forget everything about my life and everything. I just become happy and excited of what I'm about to do and show those people what I'm good at. Through music, I was able to regain strength and to have confidence in myself and believe in who I am.
Music allows them to channel a variety of emotions: love, suffering, joy, tragedy, whatever it may be. And instead of expressing that negatively, it's a positive outlet. Once the music's in you, it never leaves you. And it's beautiful.
We do not spare anything to provide the means for them to go above the levels of their society, their environment, and compete on an international level.
And so ordinary resources, which we purposefully use, that fit a given situational and cultural context, will obviate the need for extraordinary resilience, I believe. Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you, Linda, for a fascinating and inspiring presentation, an amazing unpacking of some of the complexities of resilience and the way it needs to negotiate both the individual, the social, and the systemic, and particularly in contexts like South Africa. So that was really fascinating. We're nearly out of time, but there are one or two questions. So I think I'll just take them quickly and then we can wrap up after that. The first question is asking you whether there are differences in terms of the experience of young people across different contexts in Africa, whether, yes, what are the differences in across the continent? And then it related to that is a question around the experience of diaspora, African diaspora communities in a context like Australia and the challenges that they experience around integration and so on, and resilience.
I'm not sure whether the question about differences relates to differences in adversities or differences in resilience enablers.
I think both, yes.
Okay. I think that the challenges, the shocks and the stresses that I showed in the initial slides are pretty pervasive across Africa. And so although it is true that young people who are less exposed to poverty, and that this is a racialized, sadly still in Africa, it is racialized. White young people tend to be less exposed. Young people of color are more exposed, but the majority of African young people do have to learn to manage relentless shocks and stresses. So I don't think that young people in South Africa necessarily have different experiences from young people in Uganda, for example, with the exception that there is not necessarily armed conflict at the scale of the armed conflict in some of the more northern African countries, in the more southern African countries. The resilience enablers are pretty pervasive across Africa. That's what the reviews have shown. We've reviewed the work in South Africa, we've reviewed the work in sub-Saharan Africa, and repeatedly young people refer to their personal strengths and how these personal strengths are co-facilitated, usually by informal social networks, and that's the problem. So across Africa, we need to move towards understanding that systems have to purposefully engineer structural, ecological, and formal supports to sustain what we are seeing as ordinary resilience. And I'm happy to send you the references for those reviews if whoever asked the question would like to be able to read more about them. Again, though, just to flag that contexts are always fluid, so that could change. I'm not as familiar with the work that has been done with African young people who've left Africa and migrated or moved elsewhere. What I am aware of is that they tend to continue to draw, as far as I know, on the same understanding of a cohesive, a family system, a family community, although it's less of a family community when they move overseas, and how important that is to their resilience. So of the studies that I've read, their resilience continues to be truly scaffolded by the people who are with them, but they miss, from what I can understand, the idea of this wider community that can be trusted. And I'm not saying that overseas communities can't be trusted. I just think it might have to do with the experience of being somebody who's not from that community. And so perhaps that's telling us that if we want to make resilience ordinary for African young people who leave Africa and settle elsewhere, we need to find a way of making them a member of the communities that they have moved to, and supporting them to feel that they can trust that community.